Deep Sea Embers Chapter 81 to 90. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 81 Inches Memory Deviation. The arrival of a scholar who ran to a public school to teach history for some reason was an unexpected situation for Duncan and an opportunity. Best of all, the individual seems to have an exceptional relationship with his niece Nina. Nina didn't know why her uncle Duncan suddenly agreed to the home visit. But nevertheless, she's not going to bash a good thing. It's been a very long time since they managed to share a happy moment like this. It's time to eat. Duncan beckoned his niece, who was in a daze, to sit at the table. He had cooked up a pot of fish stew and warmed up the bread Nina bought this afternoon. There were also some onion rings and fries he found in the grocery bag, but that's not really something he's interested in. Remember to get up early for school tomorrow. Oh, okay, Uncle Duncan. Nina agreed and obediently came to the table. The aroma of fish soup had already drifted up from the table, so the smell hit the young lady as soon as she sat. With a disbelieving look at her uncle. It's so fragrant, Uncle, when did your cooking become so good? Can this also be considered good? Duncan couldn't help but smile. Compared to Alice's headless cooking, Nina's evaluation definitely fell into line. Could it be that I was very bad at cooking? That can no longer be described as very bad. You used to cook according to the standard of being passable as long as it doesn't kill the person. Every time you would pull me over to test the poison with you. Nina muttered, recalling the bone-chilling experience of the tastes that hit her tongue in the past. Once you made a dish so unpalatable that you couldn't eat it yourself, you had to throw it in the trash. Then afterward, we ran over to the family restaurant next door to solve the lunch problem. When we returned, we saw the neighbor's dog lying beside the trash can and vomiting nonstop. Since then, that dog would run away whenever he sees you. As the young lady continued, her voice expectedly grew weaker. Actually, forget what I just said. You never did like it when I mentioned these things. Duncan was silent. In the remaining memories of this body, there was nothing of that sort mentioned by Nina. In fact, those fragments only contained the happiness they shared. Yes, there were also a lot of weird and silly interactions that dissipated following the man's death. Duncan would need to be more careful when touching such subjects. N-O-V-E-L-B-J-N.C. Ohm. As Nina silently broke a piece of the hard bread and dunked it into the delicious broth, Duncan took this opportunity to reach out and rub the child's hair. Uncle. The girl looks up in surprise. Ads by PubFuture. Don't worry. Your uncle's research on the new dish was successful. Duncan said solemnly like he meant it. The two exchanged a long look with each other as if to confirm whether the other was lying. Then out of the blue, the girl broke out into a hysterical laugh. Uncle, you look so funny. Don't make fun of adults. Duncan shot a sideway glance at Nina while smirking mischievously. Oh right, I intend to tidy up the store in the coming days. So if you see any strange objects lying around that you don't recognize, don't touch them until I come back. He's preparing for the next shuttling of items between the two places as he develops eyes ability. Unfortunately, there are bound to be items he couldn't hide from Nina's eyes, so it's better if he gets her vaccinated for the changes in advance. Nina didn't suspect anything and quickly nodded as the ghost captain continued. I also plan to add an extra hand in the store to look after things. This is in case I go out during the day, so don't get surprised if you find a stranger in the store, okay? This time, he was paving the way for Alice's arrival. There are still many things to consider before letting the puppet doll enter planned. Like making sure Alice's supernatural existence wouldn't cause harm to the surroundings or covering up those joints so others wouldn't realize she's a puppet. But most importantly, he needs to figure out how to keep that head screwed on properly without falling off randomly. Nina looked at Duncan in surprise. Uncle, you're even hiring a new clerk to help with the store. That's a big deal. Have you chosen someone yet? What kind of person are they? Duncan thought for a moment, trying to filter out a long list of not-so-good adjectives out of his head until he grimaced. There are really not many positives he could say. That's a hard-working young lady. In the end, the only word he could use to describe Alice in a positive light was hardworking. Then he saw the expression on Nina's face change subtly. The girl was eyeing her uncle up and down until she couldn't hold back. Young lady. Uncle, are you? Duncan had experience in this field, so he knew exactly what the niece was thinking. Immediately knocking the table to reimpose his status as the elder, focus on dinner. Quit thinking about other things. Ads by PubFuture. Nina immediately held back her laughter and made a scream inside. The nosy inner fairy was running amok right now. However, that giggling delight was promptly replaced by a widened-eye surprised face after tasting the fish. It's so good. Duncan laughed while breaking some of the bread to feed I. Then eat more. There's still some more in the kitchen. Just like that, Nina and her uncle Duncan shared a warm and happy dinner that hadn't been possible inside this antique shop for many years. And after everything was cleaned up after dinner, Duncan stopped the girl again, who was about to return to her room for rest. He had something to confirm. Nina, I have something I want to ask you. Huh? Nina grew curious. What's the matter? Do you remember things from when you were a child? Duncan deliberated on where to start and recalled what he had heard from the cultists. The stuff that happened when you were 6. Nina frowned over the odd question. She didn't know why her uncle suddenly mentioned the old incident 11 years ago. 11 years have passed, and she was only 6 years back then, so her memories aren't the greatest. As such, her heart didn't feel too much sadness when mentioning the tragedy back then. I was young and can't remember many things, but I do remember it was a mess. There were panicking adults everywhere. Some say there was a factory leak near the crossroad. Others claim there was a collective frenzy in the lower 3rd Street. Some even claimed it happened in the upper sector too. Most of what I know was retold to me by the adults later on. Duncan thought for a moment and locked eyes with Nina's. Then do you remember a fire? I fled from that big fire with you. Your parents, they were in that fire. He only tentatively mentioned it, but he didn't expect Nina to suddenly widen her eyes and react so strongly. Fire. Uncle, you really remember that there was a big fire at that time? Of course I remember. Duncan knew that something was really wrong based upon Nina's reaction. Is it wrong that I remember there's a fire? I also remember that there was a huge fire, Nina said quickly, a little excited even. But when I told the adults around me, no one could remember it. They all said I was scared and imagining things. There was no place to catch fire. Then later, when I grew older, I even went out of my way to find the original newspaper. Speaking of this, she stopped and slowly shook her head with a strange expression, but even the newspaper didn't mention any fire. All the records say that there was a leak in a factory. The chemicals caused widespread hallucinations. Chapter 82 inches the fire that exists only in memory. Nina went back to her room and slept. In this world, most people go to bed early and get up early because the time after the sun recedes is dangerous. The shimmer of the world's creation could make the world warp to its peak, and even if there are lights in the city, people must still face the night with caution. Duncan didn't feel the slightest bit sleepy tonight though. He turned off the lights in the house and came to the window in his shirt, casually admiring the night view of the city state of plan while reminiscing about his conversation with Nina after dinner. Nina remembers a fire, and the rest of his body remembers when they fled from that collapsing building. That night, the streets were in a frenzy, with cries and screams of fear shrouded in the fog. Yet, only the two of them remember that dreadful flame in this modern day. Nina had spoken to other adults about it, of course. However, they all dismissed it as a deranged memory after a child experienced some traumatic event. This was reinforced by the newspaper from 11 years ago claiming there's only a factory leak at the lower sector near the crossroad. Duncan frowned slightly, musing over another suspicious point he found, that was, himself. According to Nina's recount, Uncle Duncan doesn't remember the fire. Only she does. The girl even mentioned it to Uncle Duncan, although it should be Ron, at the time when she was a child. However, like all the other adults, her Uncle Duncan dismissed the idea of the kid being scared and hallucinating. Where did things go wrong? Why did Nina's uncle not remember the fire at all, yet I can clearly find the corresponding image in the depths of this body? Is that Ron lying to his niece all this time? Or was the memory unsealed because I took over this body? Duncan unconsciously tapped his fingers on the windowsill, silently mulling over the timeline. According to what he gathered from the Soonists, 11 years ago, the sun fragment first appeared in the territory of the city-state of Planned, causing a large range vision to occur inside the city limits. That's also the year Nina became orphaned. Even though many civilians were affected, no one seemed to remember the fire besides from Nina. Since then, the sun fragment has been dormant with no signs of further activity. Then moving forward to 4 years ago, the followers of the sun god tried to awaken the sleeping sun fragment again. That incident got extinguished by the newly promoted Inquisitor Vanna and dealt a heavy blow to those cultists. Since then, the Church of the Sun was effectively expelled from planned following that massive purge. Ads by PubFuture. However, that doesn't mean the failed ritual didn't have an effect. On the contrary, the energy gathered from the dead had stirred the slumbering sun fragment. At that time, the uncle, who Nina had depended on since being orphaned, contracted a strange disease. The illness eventually tormented the man to the point that he would resort to any remedy, including joining the ranks of the sun cult as a minion. NOBLBJN.C. Ohm. Moving further forward to a time not long ago, the news of the active sun fragment began attracting suntists to regather in the city to hold a sacrificial ceremony. That's when Duncan happened to step in and get involved. Throughout the timeline, many things seem to be faintly connected, but all lack key evidence to prove. But the most suspicious thing remains to be the event from 11 years ago when the sun fragment caused a huge vision. Did the city-state authorities erase the truth of that accident and erase the traces of the fire? And then for the sake of maintaining order, the whole thing was publicized as a collective hallucination caused by a leak in the factory. But that doesn't explain why the fire doesn't exist in many people's memories at all, unless the authorities have gone to great lengths to reshape the memories of all involved. And there is another point. In this world, anomalies and visions are open to the public. So even children know the existence and harmfulness of supernatural things. The authorities are obviously aware of this and have always adhered to the policy of announcing dangers in advance to ensure that citizens have a sense of self-preservation. So if it is really just a fire caused by supernatural powers, why do they have to hide it? Unless there is a more significant issue behind the fire, so much so that even the disclosure of news can cause some domino effect of spreading. Duncan frowned suddenly at thinking this. Or there is another possibility. The phenomenon is strange in nature. In many cases, the harm it causes is not only limited to the physical level but even distorts human cognition and the information written down on paper. What if the sun fragment had contaminated everything from civilians to the very top of the city government? A part of Duncan felt like he was going a little too far in his theories. As a novice in the field of supernatural events, his imagination lacked credible support. But on the other hand, he also couldn't stop driving toward these theories. People's memories, the authorities' records, and even the archives written a decade ago could be distorted and replaced. Of course, something like that would have been dismissed by him right away in the past. However, he couldn't be a stronger believer in this phenomenon. Ads by PubFuture. Why? Because the place where he was located now was called Duncan Antique Shop, a business that specializes in selling counterfeits to the locals. With a gentle sigh, Duncan lowered his head and looked through the second-floor window and onto the street illuminated by gas lamps. Now there was only one question left: why does Nina remember the fire when everything else said otherwise? This was crucial and the key to solving the big question. Upper sector of planned, in a mansion belonging to the managing official. Vanna jerks awake from a terrible nightmare. But this time, the nightmare was no longer related to the black sun like it usually does, nor did it point to the vanished returning from subspace. Instead, she dreamt about what happened when she was a child. That foggy night where it's filled with blood and smoke, all she could remember were the horrendous screams of panicking mobs trying to flee from the pursuing shadows. All Vanna could do as a helpless child of 12 was watch it all burn. Knowing she would not get any rest tonight, the Inquisitor pulled herself up from bed and came before the dresser where a mirror stood. Looking at her own reflection, the lady was clearly not feeling well until she whispered the storm goddess's name. Once done, a wave of peace and clarity returned to the female Inquisitor. At least I'm not dreaming of that ship now. As soon as her voice fell, the lady suddenly heard footsteps from the corridor where a knock promptly came from the door. Vanna. Vanna, are you having nightmares again? It was her uncle's voice, the most admired administrator of the city-state. I'm okay. Vanna steadied herself and sorted her clothes a bit before opening the door. Dante Wayne, a gray-haired and not too burly man, stood at the doorway and watched his niece with concern. Having lost an eye in an incident, The man now possesses an eyeball made of ruby with delicate gold patterns inside the eyeball. The hideous scars from 11 years would have scared any unfamiliar adult, let alone a child. Still, Vanna knew how kind and fair her uncle was at heart despite the stern face. "Yaaa, I had a nightmare." She rubbed those eyes, her tone a little helpless. "I didn't expect to wake you up." "Don't fret about it. I'm old. I'm a light sleeper." Dante Wayne continued, showing a concerned face, dreaming of childhood again. That incident again. Chapter 83 Inches the Entanglement. Vanna's mind finally calmed down somewhat after her uncle brought an herbal liquor over. The power of medicine and alcohol always did help with a person's tension regardless of the era. You get nightmares every time you stay home, and it's always about that event from your childhood. Dante Wayne's voice came from behind the Inquisitor, who had come out to the balcony and observed the city. As an Inquisitor, this is an unwanted sign of weakness, Vanna mutters. She was more than a head taller than her uncle, but the lady never minded showing her true side in front of this elder who effectively raised herself. "I am distressed. Did you talk to Heidi yet? She recommended 4 types of brain surgeries and 2 nerve puncture treatments." Vanna sighed. "Given the years of friendship we have, I didn't beat her." That's definitely something she would say. After all, she doesn't deal with normal people that often. Dante Wayne shook his head. "Actually, I didn't expect that after all these years, you were still trapped by the nightmare of that night. I thought I had come out of it too." Vanna rubbed her temple. "Maybe it really has something to do with this big house. As soon as I return here, I will dream about what it was like. Maybe I should consider holding another exorcism ceremony for this house, otherwise I will keep thinking this house carries the shadow of that disaster." Uncle Dante contemplated the suggestion and didn't raise an objection. "Is there still that fire in your nightmare this time?" Ads by PubFuture. Vanna nodded. "Yes, there are fires everywhere. You escaped from the fire with me on your back. I even remember clearly that we fled the city from the factory's pipeline, and a burning building nearby was gradually collapsing in the fire." Speaking of this, she stopped and landed her gaze on her uncle. "You don't remember the fire, do you?" "Not only do I not remember, nobody else does." The serious-faced administrator slowly shook his head. "I only remember the leaked gas pipes and those cultists who went berserk. There were many parties that night, but only one seemed to remember seeing the raging fire." Vanna didn't speak for a while and fell into deep thought. Then, after an unknown amount of time, she suddenly said softly, "Except for the fire incident, my memories and yours are consistent. I didn't understand anything back then, but now I know very well that this must be some kind of supernatural force exerting influence. Even after becoming a saint, I still can't dispel that influence. There could only be 2 answers. The one responsible is so powerful that they left an imprint on your soul for life, or the source of the influence of that incident remains hidden somewhere in the city. I have been investigating this matter for years, but unfortunately, there has been little progress thus far." Dante Wayne's tone ended with a hint of apologies. Not only for being unable to solve his niece's distress but also for failing to investigate an old case as the highest government official. The Great Chaos, 11 years ago left a scar that's far too deep, both physically and mentally on everyone involved. Vanna knew that this matter was not only her own phantom at work, but also a plague on her uncle's heart. Not knowing how to comfort others well, the Inquisitor could only try to divert the topic. "I remember that a lot of cultists were arrested back then. Judging from the assessment count after the engagement, that incident was even larger than the Black Sun incident 4 years ago. Yes, thousands of people were arrested, so many that I wondered how it's possible for so many cultists to hide inside planned unnoticed." Dante Wayne sighed. "And there is more than one sect involved. There are the Suntists who follow the Black Sun, Annihilators who worship the Nether Lord, and even those Ender missionaries who worship subspace itself. These maggots in the gutters all emerged that night, deranged and wreaked havoc." November LBJNN. Vanna stared at Dante with more intent now, but according to the results of the subsequent interrogation, none of the saboteurs arrested by the authorities can be called the mastermind. No one even knows why they caused chaos that night. It was as if they were all detonated at the same time and went into collective madness. Ads by PubFuture. Dante didn't speak for a while for he too believed it was not normal. Then he noticed the look coming from his niece. "The reason for your irritability should not just be because of that nightmare, is it?" Suddenly mentioning these things is related to the recent unstable situation in the city-state. Vanna did not evade the question. There is indeed a certain connection. The scientists converging on plan are searching for an anomaly, called the sun fragment, and the vanished has reappeared in the real world almost simultaneously. Everything is pointing to us here, reminding me of the chaos from 11 years ago. I have ordered all ports to strictly check the movement of people and communicated with the other administrators of neighboring city-states. We've already cracked down on many cultists and effectively cut off their means of flowing into plan because of these measures. All that's left to do is to wait on what the church does. The supernatural area is the specialty of the Guardians. Speaking of this, the middle-aged admin suddenly stopped as if to ponder his following words. But after a moment of hesitation, he decides it's best to say it. As for the matter of the vanished, I can't help much in the transcendent realm, but in the worldly aspect, I have an idea. Secular aspect. Vanna frowned. Wait, you mean Lucretia Abnomar, captain of the pioneer exploration ship Bright Star, and Tyrion Abnomar, the pirate leader of the Northern Seas and captain of the Sea Mist, Dante said unhurriedly. It is true that the vanished is a ghost ship beyond the understanding of reality, but as long as it has been a member of the real world will have an anchor related to it. I wonder how Captain Duncan's son and daughter will react to their father's reappearance in the world. Vanna's eyes slowly widened. She was used to using simple and crude methods to directly deal with her enemies, so she had never considered anything related to the vanished from this perspective. But soon the lady frowned. But I heard those two hardly deal with the city-state authorities. They are rulers of their own turf on the boundless sea and maintains a cold relationship with the city-states. This is normal. After all, they are the children of that ghost captain. The Bright Star and the Sea Mist are the two escorts of the original vanished. Although they parted ways 100 years ago, in the eyes of most city-states, they are still the embodiment of curses and dangers. It is not so much they alienated the civilized world, but rather the civilized world actively avoids them. Vanna frowned and appeared wary at her uncle's plan. Then do you expect them to come and help plan against their father? It's just an idea, but it's worth a try. Dante grew serious. After all, we all know that the Bright Star and Sea Mist parted ways with the vanished more than a century ago. That happened before the event on the 13 islands of Witherland. Rumor is that some ship captains witnessed the Sea Mist battle the vanished in the northern seas half a century ago. At that point, the vanished had already become the legendary ghost ship. This may explain the attitude of the two captains towards their father. More than half a century ago, at that time, the Sea Mist was still the flagship of the Frost Queen. That Captain Tyrion was probably just being ordered to protect the city-state, Vanna said slowly while pondering. But you are right. At least this proves that the Sea Mist has a record of confrontation with the vanished. But she still had some doubts, which she voiced after a few seconds of thought. What if the Bright Star and Sea Mist ignored planned, what then? That's why this is just an attempt, Dante said quietly, and I'll spread the word and find a way to get the news into the ears of those two captains. After that, we can only wait and watch for their reaction afterward. Chapter 84 Inches Captain Duncan's offspring. Even ghosts were once members of the real world, and the vanished was no different despite the fact that it crashed into subspace a century ago. It's built by real craftsmen from the material world, and Captain Duncan was also a human being before turning into a shadow of subspace. For ordinary seafarers, everything related to the vanished must be veiled with a layer of curses and freakiness, as if the terrifying ghost captain was a creation directly bred from subspace. No one will think about whether a natural disaster wandering on the sea has any personal joy or anger, nor about his interpersonal relationships. In their minds, Captain Duncan symbolizes a natural phenomenon, an existence without a trace of origin. Fear builds walls in human hearts, and walls blind the souls to the truth on the other side. But as an inquisitor specializing in confronting of this fear, Vanna knows how to discern the true parts from a series of legends, exaggerations, and whispers. The terrible captain of the vanished, when he was still a human, before the events of the 13 islands of Witherland, also had his best friends and family members. He also had loyal sailors and adjutants under him. He also needed to go to the port to maintain supplies and deal with the city-state authorities. He couldn't have been born a mobile natural disaster. Captain Duncan also had two children, the eldest son Tyrion Abnomar, and his daughter Lucretia Abnomar. They are both alive due to a curse that prolonged their lifespan. Like their father, the two children also commanded their own powerful ships that hovered on the fringes of the civilized world. As within expectation, they weren't exactly kind to the civilization either. They're cold, vaguely antagonistic to the point sailors wouldn't even dare to link the pair to the infamous Captain Duncan. Nowadays, only the most well-learned and knowledgeable are aware of the family relationship. On the other hand, despite their frosty relationship with the city-states, the two captains weren't hostile either. The Bright Star, helmed by Ms. Lucretia Abnomar, was a mighty, pioneering exploration ship passionate about exploring the world's limits. Rumor has it the ship has even reached the very edge of the known world, where she witnessed unimaginable wonders. No one knows exactly what she was looking for on the edge of the world. Still, on rare occasions that she did report back to the Adventurers Guilds through a messenger, the stories told reported were worthy of being turned into books and a Medal of Honor. Of course, no one would consider it an honor if it meant becoming a living curse. Nevertheless, this was proof of goodwill that she was still on the side of humanity. Tyrion Abnomar, on the other hand, was less fleeting and distant than his sister. The man was closer to the human world and definitely more dangerous. More than half a century ago, he served the Frost City state of the Northern Seas, and now he's the most powerful pirate captain sailing these icy waters. This moody captain controlled nearly half of the main shipping routes of the Cold Sea. With the Sea Mist as its flagship, he commanded more than a dozen warships under its banner. But in reality, he had already surpassed a simple pirate and grown to become a semi-official power outside of the city-states. Ads by PubFuture. As for how this Captain Tyrion went from being a general under the Queen of Frost to becoming a pirate head, people had different theories. Some say he was the mastermind of the Frostbite Rebellion half a century ago, the man who personally put the Frost Queen on the guillotine. Then using the looted wealth from that city-state, he built up his powerful pirate crew. Another version was the opposite. A few scholars believe that Tyrion Abnomar fought for the Queen until the last moment during the Frostbite Rebellion. That he became a pirate out of spite for the other city-states and menaced the shipping route out of obsession with avenging the Queen. Vanna didn't know how much of the speculation in this chaotic world was true or false, and considering the personalities of the two captains, they should not be interested in explaining their affairs to the world. But one thing was certain, the reappearance of the Vanished was definitely a major event for them that needed attention. After all, the siblings had betrayed the Vanished with their respective ships more than a century ago, and now their furious father had returned from subspace. Of course, as Dante Wayne said, this was just a spare card. It's great if the card comes in handy, but one couldn't rely on such a card. N-O-V-E, in .c ohm. When the bell tower of the neighborhood church rang, the special rhythm of the whistle also broke the silence of the night, signaling the city residents to be awake and go about their day. Nina got up early to prepare breakfast today. Therefore, Duncan's nose was already hit with the aroma of mushroom sauce and bread before he managed to dispel the drowsiness in his body. Sitting at the dining table. "Do you want a bicycle?" he asks after noticing a bunch of people riding along the streets outside the window. Bicycle. Nina was stunned for a moment and waved her hand. "That's so expensive, and I don't need it." "It's easier to go to school," Duncan said. "You don't have to worry about money. I'll figure it out." Ads by PubFuture. He had thought about it seriously already. Although this antique store did not look good, but judging by the accumulation and rotation of goods in the warehouse and the cash stored in the shop, it should actually have stable weekly sales. Definitely more than enough to feed two people. As to why Nina's so strapped in her spending, that's entirely due to the former uncle donating over half of his wealth to the cult. The remaining got squandered on spirits and medicine. Now that this depraved living was over, it's only proper that Nina got a better living standard. Of course, he doesn't know how to run a store, and the few purchase channels he knows in his memory are also a little vague. Nevertheless, he would manage somehow if he slowly adapted. The key was to get Nina accustomed to her uncle becoming a reliable elder again. But that's so expensive. Nina lowered her head and muttered, then bit into the hard bread. Duncan wanted to say something to that when his voice got interrupted by a knock from the first floor. So early, who could it be when we're not even open yet? Nina was stunned for a moment when she heard the knock. Getting up, she hurried downstairs. "I'll go down and check." Watching the fleeing girl, Duncan broke a piece of bread and threw it at the dove who was pacing around the table. You say, in addition to opening a normal store, what other way is there to make money relatively fast? Do we need to open a logistics company? The bird suddenly jumped 2 steps to the side, flapping its wings angrily, but it is not amusing to me. Then she began to yap non-stop. That bastard is furious and picked up the demonic snake spear to sacrifice Elder Tang to the stake. I will karate chop with a spinning dragon kick. There will be blood on his head. Full screen ahead. Duncan's whole person was dumbfounded. He could not understand a single thing the bird just spoke after Nina left there. But he couldn't blame I for bursting out like this. She must have been a mess inside at holding back her urge to speak. Then before the dove could yap some more, Nina's voice suddenly came from the first floor. This time, the young lady's voice sounded a little nervous. Uncle Duncan. There are 2 policemen here to see you. Police. 2 of them came to see me this early in the morning. This time it was Duncan's turn to be stunned. Immediately ordering the bird to stay put and out of sight, he hurried downstairs where he saw Nina looking over his way nervously. 2 policemen were standing at the doorway. Chapter 85 Inches Reward. Duncan affirmed his composure and walked towards the 2 policemen at the door. He had nothing to fear in any case. The guy did not do any sabotage, nor did he have any conflict with the authorities. Although Captain Duncan was infamous around these parts, but what did the mobile natural disaster of the boundless sea have to do with this honest antique store owner? If there's anything to be suspicious about, it would only be the fact that he attended the cultist gathering before running off to report it. Wait a minute, report. Duncan suddenly remembered this stubble and immediately got a vague guess as to the reason why the 2 policemen came to his residence. Now he's even more confident in his footsteps, but that obviously didn't translate to Nina's nerve. Uncle, you must answer the policeman's question honestly, the young lady urgently murmurs as she brushes shoulders with her uncle. Duncan suddenly faltered and casts a strange look at his niece. Is that the image I have in your heart? Nina returned the look with a face that was even more exaggerated. It's the same type of expression that happens when an alcoholic swears he won't be drinking again. Then what else could the police come for this early in the morning? Duncan. He sighed helplessly and finished the distance to the door with a big, bright smile. Good morning, gents. What can I do for the both of you? Mr. Duncan, the older of the 2 policemen began with a polite and businesslike tone, we found this place according to the registered address. The tip you reported to the patrol officers yesterday has been confirmed. On behalf of City Hall, we thank you for your contribution in helping with the maintenance of order. We're also here to hand you your reward. When the words fell, the young officer next to him stepped forward and handed over a paper envelope that looked quite thick. Ads by PubFuture. Nina had widened her eyes from the sidelines after seeing the parcel. Duncan had guessed as much. However, he didn't expect the reward money to be directly brought to his door like this. Not being shy, he accepted the package and was surprised when he saw the words, 435 Sora, imprinted on the disposable wax seal. That's a generous amount for any residents in the lower sector. So there's a bounty reward. Duncan squeezed the paper parcel and relished in the thickness of the banknotes. I wasn't even thinking about it at the time. Of course there is a bounty. The admitatchers pay great heed to the fight against the evil lurking inside the city-state, especially in recent times. All valid reports are rewarded generously, so do keep that in mind. The younger officer chuckles with amusement at the shop owner's lack of awareness, not to mention the clues you provided are very special. Hearing this, Duncan's heart couldn't help but jerk with attention. Acting casually like he's only curious. By the way, I didn't dare to go over there and take a look for myself, but what exactly happened? The 2 officers exchanged a look with each other and then actually stepped inside the shop. Nina didn't miss this and promptly closed the door behind everyone. We did not go to the scene ourselves. The matter was dealt with by the Guardians. However, according to the information that came through the proper channels, the situation was terrible, said the younger officer, who had not yet fully learned the businesslike tone of his senior. You were right to not take a look. If you had gone, you would have likely fallen into severe danger. Duncan was stunned for a moment before quickly coming back to attention. This was the lower sector, where sewage and toxins flow from the upper sector. If heretics and evil were to take up residence, it would surely be in these shabby and winding alleys. Although the neighborhood where the antique shop was located could already be considered a decent place in the lower sector, it still doesn't change the fact that it's part of the lower sector. Slum or no slum. On the other hand, even if we did not consider there may be cultists lurking among ordinary folks in the lower sector, a person who reports to the authorities and collects a bounty was very likely to be the target of vigilance here anyway. The officers who are familiar with the local situation certainly know this, therefore, the reminder here was a routine habit and a deed out of good intentions. Duncan thought about it and felt that the reminder was right as well. Ads by PubFuture. This place was indeed prone to cultists, he still has the sun talisman in his pocket. Thank you for the reminder, he thanked the two sincerely. Although the ghost captain didn't know what the average standard here was, but at least the two in front gave a good impression. Do you want to take a break here? No need, the older officer waved his hand and turned toward the exit, we still have patrol duty that must be attended to. The young officer promptly followed as well. If you still encounter clues in the future, please report it to the authorities. The security of the city-state affects each and every one of us. Of course, Duncan squeezed the paper bag in his hand and formed a genuine smile. I have always been a good citizen who cares about the order of the city-state. Once the two men wearing the dark blue uniforms were out of sight, Nina immediately turned back to look at her uncle, who was already counting the money bills inside. Uncle, is this really a reward from City Hall? You actually, really? The girl opened her mouth but found it awkward to speak the next part. You can really do good things. Duncan knew what Nina was thinking and chuckled at her troubled mindset. It was when I was coming home yesterday. Your uncle, I have always been enthusiastic about public welfare. Nina, but I was surprised to have such a huge bounty reward. Duncan didn't wait for Nina to speak to mutter his inner greed while looking down at the banknotes. This is faster than making money from the shop. There was another sentence he didn't say. According to the information he had before, there were still many cultists from various city-states hiding in the city. That's all money. Nina took a good moment to return to her senses. Uncle, what did you say? Ads by PubFuture. Nothing. Forget what I said, Duncan said casually and waved the topic off. Weren't you going to school today? Don't be late. By the way, when is Mr. Morris coming for the home visit? In the afternoon. I only have one class in the afternoon, Nina said, as if thinking of something. Uncle, are you still going out today? Duncan nodded. But I'll be home before your history teacher comes. When Nina heard this, she immediately looked suspiciously over his way. Uncle, what are you going to do? Duncan smiled extraordinarily brightly. Your uncle is going out hunting today. He already got an idea in mind. Since the sun talisman was so easy to use, plus the authorities are so willing to offer up a bounty, so why not take advantage of this point? He's going to make trouble for these suntists anyway. No reason not to kill two birds with one stone. Nina was a smart girl. Even if she doesn't know the full story, she could already guess what Duncan meant by hunting, in this case. With a wrinkled forehead, Uncle, it's not right for you to do this. You also said yesterday that you want to properly operate the shop. If you want to rectify the situation with the shop, then you need to recruit an assistant first. I know, but there's no contradiction in running a shop and helping with the city's security, is there? Duncan waved his hand to reassure his niece. Let your uncle here worry about the shop. You focus on school first. Yet, instead of doing as told, Nina promptly grabbed a chair and sat down next to him with a firm face. Nina, Uncle, it's so dangerous. Nina looked up and stared at her precious uncle. Duncan. Actually. I'm going to keep an eye on you. Nina sat there stubbornly. Just now those two gentlemen already mentioned how dangerous it is as of late. It's one thing that you accidentally encountered the matter. How can you actively go out to search for such dangers? Duncan was taken aback by the 17-year-old girl's statement because she really does care for him. Though the way was stubborn and crude, but it was from the heart. I don't want a bike. Nina lowered her head and muttered quietly. Go to school. Duncan sighed and stepped forward with a smile, then ruffled Nina's hair. Nina looked up in surprise. You're right, it's dangerous, Duncan said seriously. I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait here in the store for you to come back. Chapter 86 Inches a better solution. Nina went to school, and as she had done many times in the past, the girl once again believed her uncle's promise that he would stay home until she returned. Maybe she has long been unconvinced, but she still insists on holding faith. Duncan stood behind the window on the first floor of the antique shop as he watched Nina's trotting figure quickly make a turn around the corner and disappear from his field of view. November LBJNN. Uncle Duncan would wait for her to come home at the store, as he promised. Come here. As soon as the thought flashed in his heart, a green flame stream streaked through the air and materialized before Duncan. Through the connection established by the ghost fire, Duncan could clearly perceive the position of the dove and the state she's in. Although it was not yet possible to fully share the five senses, this level of perception could already do a lot of things. Duncan lowered his head and stared into little Mungbean eyes. You are actually very smart. Not only can you fully understand my words, but you can also do many things, right? The dove immediately flapped its wings proudly. Loyalty, loyalty. Then I have a bold idea right now. I want you to try it. Duncan smiled, then took out the sun talisman that had now become a cultist approach alarm from his pocket. He carefully wrapped the badge with a cloth to prevent it from being exposed to ordinary people and then tied it to Ai's back with a strip of fabric. Go fly around town, and when the badge heats up, search for the place that resonates. Preferably directly to the building. Duncan explains his intent. I will keep track of the location from my end, right? First fly around the lower sector and the crossroad. Don't go to the upper sector yet since I'm not familiar with that area. I can't determine the address based on the positioning alone. The dove flapped her wings and tilted its head. Make some fries. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan grimaced. If you can locate one place, then I will bury you with fries. Without saying a word, the bird flapped its wings and rushed out the gate as if afraid the owner would regret the agreement. The ghost captain watched with a smile as the bird flew away in the sky. With his tracking ability of eye improved, the man could clearly perceive the dove's movement through the ghost fire. Then by matching the approximate location in his head to a map, Duncan should be able to pinpoint anything they find along the way. Exhaling softly, he leans back against the counter to comfortably wait. He promised Nina that he wouldn't go out, asking for danger, so it's only natural he kept his promise. However, he never said anything about not writing report letters to the authority from his home. To be fair, this was a better solution since I could cover more distances and increase the range by wandering the city. Of course, this method also had disadvantages, and that was not being able to gather intel from the cultists. But Duncan didn't care much about this regret. According to the experience of attending the last rally, those cultists who could easily be found were actually a group of minions that were disposable by those in charge. The big fish would need to be uncovered differently, hence why the ghost captain would change the plan. Also, let's not forget I had more ability than just flying around with a sensor. Her job was express delivery. Imagine finding a big fish who was unprepared. I could swoop in and transport the foe onto the vanished. By that point, haha. There's no escape for the poor sucker by that point. Duncan could take his sweet time interrogating the prisoner. Then to top things off with a cherry, he hadn't experimented with transporting live humans yet. Duncan wouldn't kidnap random people off the street for his own gains, but he wouldn't have any qualms about experimenting with ruthless cultists that committed mass murder. When necessary, even pure trash could be suitable consumables. Duncan leaned back in his chair and relished in his own ingenuity. The only problem now was to consider how he would explain this to Nina, why the authorities would issue so many reward bounties to her uncle. As the man dwelled on the matter, another idea suddenly popped up. Is there such a thing as banks in this world that's developed into the industrial age? This was the inevitable result and a necessary condition for developing the world's economy. Although this world's banking system should be far less convenient and widespread than on Earth, the minimum account function should still be there. Ads by PubFuture. And of course, the original owner of this body did not have a bank account. The man hadn't done well in life, so it's pointless to do so. What's more, the bank services are usually reserved for those living in the upper sector, since those like Nina's family had little spare funds to speak of. Even so, banks are technically open to all walks of life regardless of one's status. As it so happens, there's a bank at the crossroad that he could visit. Making up his mind, Duncan intends to make a visit within the next 2 days. His activities are going to expand rapidly at this rate. It's crucial he got the foundation down before things really gathered steam. Besides, Giving a bank account number in the report letters would mean he could skip leaving his personal address directly on the papers. Of course, whether this was feasible will have to be tried later. After all, the original owner of his body has little experience with the city-state security department, or strictly speaking, much positive experience, but Duncan thinks it was reasonable enough. In this dangerous world, anonymous reporting should be a normal choice for many enthusiastic citizens working under caution. As for today, he's going to stay in the antique shop and relax. He still hasn't personally opened up this business yet, so it's about time he got to it. Duncan stretched and got up from behind the counter, then slowly came to the main door where he flipped the sign to the open side against the window glass. Near the crossroad, inside the dilapidated and abandoned factory, guardians of the church had already pulled up a blockade around the area when Inquisitor Vanna arrived with her blessed sword strapped to the waist. She's being accompanied by 2 storm priests as they descend the stairs to the basement floor. Here, everything remained the same after they received a report and discovered the rally, which was promptly cordoned off until now. In the huge basement, the disgusting smell of blood was particularly thick. Mix this smell with the pungent sting of burning chemicals and decapitated parts of the dead strewn along the floor, such a scene would terrify even the strongest of hearts. However, the female inquisitor wasn't one of those weak souls. She's focused and frowning because there's no traces or clues of the attackers here. It was a one-sided crushing battle. The assailants far outweighed these cultists, who were basically ordinary folks. Also, the attack appears to be sudden and abrupt with many of the cultists unable to resist or react in time. Who is responsible? Wild transcendents with whom these cultists have a personal feud? Or another powerful heresy order? Perhaps some kind of out-of-control bloody sacrifice that has gone berserk. The young inquisitor was lost in thought. Chapter 87 inches Vanna's investigation. Only the cultists' bodies were left in the rally, and no evidence could be found to prove the attacker's identity, making the investigation very difficult. But one thing's certain, it was definitely not ordinary people who carried out this attack based upon the pungent and peculiar smell remaining in the air. It's the trace of the flames that had been contaminated. Vanna carefully examined the oil lamps left in the basement. Beside her, a priest had taken out special powders and potions from the kit to analyze the lamps for residues that should not appear in the real world. Fire had always been the most remarkable thing in this world. It's the visible order, the handwriting of the gods when they make contact with the world, the evidence that civilization still exists. When the flame burns, everything changes and leaves its mark. Therefore, if there has been a supernatural level battle here, the flames should carry some corresponding traces left in there. After the priest began to get busy, Vanna returned to the middle of the basement to examine the corpse of a Sun heretic who had fallen there. Nearly every bone in the body has been broken as if they had been directly hit by raging bison. It's hard to imagine what kind of weapon could have caused such a result, a coroner said next to her. Blunt force strike, a brute force that could break dozens of bones at once. Vanna frowned slightly. What is it? A hammer with a diameter of 1 meter. The coroner shook his head. Unlikely. Compared to these, the ashes over there at the end are more suspicious. Vanna came to the end of the basement and saw the ashes mentioned by the other person. There is a complete set of clothes scattered on the floor, and the grayish-black ashes scattered between the clothes indicate this should have been a person before they died. There is no doubt that it is some kind of supernatural power at work. Judging from the traces, it may be a kind of abnormal flame, Vanna judged based on the quick assessment. Then turning back to the coroner behind herself, it is difficult for a normal flame to turn someone into ashes while preserving the person's clothes. The wall shows signs of impact, and this cultist seems to have been hit by a huge force as well before being burned by the flames, said another cleric at the scene. This cultist was the only one in the whole scene that shows visible signs of being killed by supernatural forces and a power we have never seen before. Adds by PubFuture. In addition, we have also found a spot in the corner that has been seriously corroded by an unknown element. Unfortunately, we did not find any residual physical substance that might point us to its origin. Perhaps it's also the effect of a supernatural power. N-O-B, in .c ohm. It could be a spell cast by a person, or it could be an anomaly, Vanna said casually. Was this discovered by the citizen's report? Yes, An enthusiastic citizen heard the strange noises in the abandoned factory and reported it to the officers and guardians nearby. They were in the middle of exchanging shifts for the night. The priest beside her nodded. These cultists are very cautious. They erased the traces of their activities after entering the city-state and successfully lurked in the lower city. If it were not for this attack, they would probably be able to continue without our detection. It only means that there are more dens like this hidden in the shadows, Vanna comments in a heavy voice. The gutters and alleys of the lower city are the focus of investigation this time. Just as she was halfway through her words, a guardian suddenly barged over from the side, holding something in his hand. Inquisitor, look at this. Vanna immediately looked up and saw the guardian holding a small tray containing several slightly deformed copper bullets. We found 2 revolvers that had been fired at the scene. These bullets should be from those guns, the guardian reports. And the blood on the bullets is most likely from the attacker. Vanna's eyes fell on those bullets and confirmed her peer's assessment. The tip was all deformed and contracted, but unlikely the result of hitting flesh less each of these bullets landed on bone. Such precision would be difficult. On top of that, how did these bullets, which had clearly hit their target, get left behind on the scene? Vanna thought carefully and came up with 2 possibilities. Either the attacker operated on himself to remove the bullets before departing, or the attacker had a special physical ability to drain the bullet out of the body by relying on their muscles. Whatever the possibility, one thing was obvious. This powerful assailant took out all the cultists here without delay despite being shot several times, then calmly removed the bullets after the incident. Vanna looked down at her own hands at the thought. She could do something similar like that, but it's precisely because she could that she knows how difficult it would be for mortal flesh. The one who killed these cultists should be a physically strengthened transcendent, and the weapon used is some kind of large blunt weapon. Vanna turned her head and said to a retinue. The other side has rich combat experience, is strong-willed, and is extremely powerful. Considering the weapons used, the figure should also be very tall and a master of the flame. From preliminary judgment, the perpetrator is hostile towards the Sun Heretic. For the time being, we cannot determine whether they are on our side or not. Inform all guardians and policemen at all levels to pay attention to those who meet the above characteristics. If a suspected target is found, give priority to reporting. Do not act rashly until contact is made with the main supervisors. Ads by PubFuture. The guardian who served as the retinue immediately lowered his head. Yes, Inquisitor. Vanna exhaled softly, then sketched in her mind what the attackers at the scene of the rally might look like, a 2-meter-tall man wielding a giant mace or hammer. The person is calm and fluent in martial arts and can summon a flame to do their bidding. That's pretty much how it should be. Back inside the antique shop. Duncan had just sent off the second client with a smile on his face after opening this morning. The client was a rather chubby lady who appeared pleased by her purchase since she was a regular of the shop. Today, she had taken a fancy to a pair of vases intended for the new neighbor. Obviously, the vase was not an authentic antique but an import from the wholesale market with a manufacturing date of last week. After throwing a few crumpled bills into the drawer, Duncan sat back behind the counter, feeling a little calmer in his impetuous mood. At least for now, opening this antique shop was a fun novelty for him. The profit of 6 coins could hardly be enough to satiate Duncan's appetite. It's better to stick with reporting cultists and reaping the bounty afterward. Duncan divided his energy and paid attention to the situation on I's side then. The bird had arrived at the 4th block. Unfortunately, no reaction had come from the Sun Talisman thus far. Of course, this was to be expected. Although many cultists are pouring into the city-state of Planned, they are not to the extent that they could bloom everywhere. Besides, the job was not easy by nature. Hunting requires patience. Duncan leisurely enjoyed this quiet time, dividing his energy to pay attention to the movements of the dove while occasionally shifting to the situation on the Vanished. He would also control his main body on the ship and walk around while watching Alice fiddle with the items aboard. Such a life wasn't so bad if he looked at things positively. At this moment, a crisp and pleasant sound of bells suddenly came from the direction of the doorway, interrupting his cranky thoughts under his leisure. "Welcome," Duncan said casually as he looked up at the door, where an old gentleman with gray hair had entered. It was a well-dressed old gentleman with a new and neat dark brown coat, polished leather shoes on his feet, a black cane of unknown material in his hand, and a meticulous bow tie. It's not like the wardrobe of someone that would appear in the lower city, but more like the folks up at the crossroad where the middle class would attend. Duncan had no idea about the so-called decent people of this world, but he could tell at a glance that this old gentleman was not an ordinary customer. Do you have something fancy in mind? He laughed like a real antique store manager. Take what fate befalls you. Chapter 88 inches. There is one genuine item. The old gentleman curiously glanced around after entering and took the environment in. Old furnishings, murky windows, and cheap shelves with random antiques strewn randomly along the cabinets, the perfect representation of what this business dealt with. Likely aside from the money collected thus far, there's nothing but fakes in the whole store. But even so, the old gentleman, who was dressed well for the lower city, remained interested in what he saw. That was until Duncan's voice came from the direction of the counter and interrupted his thoughts. A humorous way of selling, the old gentleman chuckles, to take away what one is destined for, ignoring the items involved, that's a beautiful phrase in itself. Actually, fate and destiny aside, you must also have money. Duncan smiled back. Fortunately, the things here are not expensive. Do you want anything? I'm not here to buy anything. The old gentleman sounded hesitant, actually. Due to this opening, Duncan had cut in and played salesman. One doesn't have to buy. Just having a look is good too. Anything that catches your eye. The old man's face couldn't help but show a trace of helplessness. Everything here are counterfeits. Yes, Duncan said with a reasonable look, why would anything here be real? I don't even have security in place for the store. That's so the thieves would lose more than they gain by robbing me. The old man's cheeks noticeably twitched over that explanation. He probably didn't expect that the antique store's owner could have such a calm attitude when saying something so blunt. After choking for several seconds, those that are good at persuading themselves will take this as an antique shop and get a pleasurable experience. Those that can't will take it as a grocery store to look for good deals. Unless you're good at deceiving yourself, who would honestly believe they've found a gold brick inside a garbage heap? Look at that bowl over there. For a simple few coins, you can enjoy a moment of pleasure that only those with immense wealth can experience. What's there to complain about? The bowl, that's the crystallization of our modern industry, you know. The old man listened to Duncan's crooked reasoning and found himself too stunned to respond. For the longest time, he kept looking back and forth from the man and bowl until he broke out into a chuckle again. Then his sight noticed something shining next to the counter, which caused his expression to freeze and turn serious. Duncan was seriously immersed in the pleasure of doing business when he noticed the change in the old man's expression. But before the shop owner could react, the old man had already stretched the hand over and grabbed onto something. This thing, the old gentleman had pulled out a well-preserved dagger in the middle of a debris pile. Ads by PubFuture. It was an old item from the vanished that Duncan had hidden here, one of only 2 genuine items in the entire antique shop. The other was the cast iron cannonball placed deeper in the pile of debris. Duncan wanted to divert the old man's attention at first, but then he noticed the light coming from the fella's eyes. It's the look of a professional who found something worthy of their time. Duncan frowned at the thought and eyed the dagger with a perplexed gaze. It's actually not a big deal if he sold the dagger. It's not a supernatural item like some of the other things aboard the Vanished, nor does it corrupt those who use it. In essence, the dagger was no different from the bowl he just mentioned. This thing, repeated the old gentleman, who had raised his head to meet Duncan's face, is it also a good in the store? This gentleman said that very tactfully, but the implication was quite obvious. Why is there a real thing in your pile of trash? A mistake on the job or what? If Duncan couldn't figure out this old gent was a person of a specialized profession, then it would be him that's a fool by this point. Retracting his smile, the crummy shop owner puts on an air of mystique. See, didn't I say you might find something you are fated to have? Then he cleared his throat and got serious. Most goods in the store are discounted, except for a few, such as this one in your hand. The old gentleman immediately glanced back at the shelves and confirmed the majority of the items were in fact products of modern society. The prices are marked in the hundreds of thousands like some real antique, but after the discount by the cross with a marker, it's only a few coins. This caused the new customer to become increasingly more amused and interested in this seemingly dilapidated antique shop. However, before the old gent could ask for the price of this dagger, the bell hanging from the doorway rang again. Duncan looked up and saw Nina's figure. "Uncle Duncan, I'm back." Nina didn't raise her head when she entered and shouted like it's common practice, "Has Mr. Morris arrived yet?" "Not that I'm aware of." Duncan glanced inside the store. "I'm entertaining." Before he could speak, he saw the old gentleman in front of him coughing dryly to interrupt. "My name is Morris." Ads by PubFuture. Duncan. "Mr. Morris." Nina immediately exclaimed in surprise after noticing her teacher's presence. Then, like every student who bumped into their teacher after school, she became visibly antsy and straightened her back. "Good afternoon." Duncan looked at Nina, then back at the old man in front of himself, then repeated that gesture 3 more times before going haywire. "I had wanted to introduce myself from the beginning." The old man spread his hands helplessly. "You kept interrupting me, so I wasn't able to." Nina had come back to her senses then and promptly noticed the dagger in her teacher's grasp. Hurrying forward. "Teacher, don't buy it. Everything in our store are fakes." Duncan shot a weird look at his niece, complaining how overly honest she must be inside to oust her own uncle in a situation like this. Although with the level of knowledge this history teacher has, Mr. Morris would likely be able to figure out that much out on his own regardless of the young lady's warning or not. On the other side, Mr. Morris shook his head after hearing Nina's warning, then raised his hand to place the dagger on the counter. "This one is real." Nina was stunned. "Ah. No, vel, b, in c ohm. This dagger most likely came from a century ago, and it was one of the favorite tools of seafarers in the city-states of Pland and Lanza at the time. But due to the bankruptcy of the central forge and the vulnerability of the items at sea, few remain in existence today. The ones that did survive are in very bad condition," Morris said while carefully picking up the dagger and drawing the blade from the scabbard. I've never seen one so well preserved. It almost looks like it was still in use not long ago. The blade is sharp and glistening with light. I can't find a single flaw in the blade's body. It also has an original scabbard too," Duncan added. "If you look closely, you'll see that it even has an original buckle on the back of the scabbard." When Morris heard this, he quickly examined the scabbard and accessories attached to it. The surprise in his eyes couldn't be ignored because it was literally beaming. "This, I really didn't notice just now. Oh, heavens. It's like this had just come off of a sailor yesterday. If I weren't so confident in my own knowledge, I would suspect this is an amazing imitation. But it even has the flawed patterns at the handle." Speaking of this, he suddenly began to doubt himself. Is it really not an imitation? Upon hearing this, Nina quickly waved her hand. "Uncle can't imitate something this real." Duncan twitched from the corner of his eye while watching his niece. "Go upstairs and do your homework." Nina was stunned for a moment. "I don't have homework today." "Then read a book." Nina stuck out her tongue and walked towards the stairs in small steps, but then glanced back at her teacher before going up the rails. "Mr. Morris, don't forget that you are here to visit." "Of course, I have a lot to talk with Mr. Duncan." Morris radiated a smile. "You go upstairs and read first." "Don't worry, I won't snitch on my own student." Nina shot both men a suspicious look like she did not believe either of them but then knew better than to die on this hill. Chapter 89 Inches Nina's Abnormality. Duncan scratched the back of his head in confusion as Nina briskly ran up the stairs while giggling. "What is this kid so happy for?" Then he heard Mr. Morris's voice coming from the counter. "Honestly, you are very different from what I had in mind, Mr. Duncan." "Big difference?" Duncan raised one eyebrow. "What is your impression of me?" As he spoke, he walked around from behind the counter and flipped the open sign at the door to closed. Then moving a chair over, he gestures for the guest to take a seat since it's improper to leave the teacher standing for a family visit. "Thank you." Morris nodded in thanks. After sitting down, the old gent looked in Duncan's direction with a gentle and elegant smile. "We haven't met before, but I've heard about you from other sources, about Nina's family situation. Forgive me for being rude, but as far as I've heard, Nina has an alcoholic uncle who is addicted to gambling and has a hot temper. Everyone tells me she's living in a dysfunctional home. As a result, Nina doesn't have any friends at school, nor do the other students want to deal with her." Duncan was brewing some coffee on the side when his hands froze over Morris's last sentence. Then realizing he was acting out of character, the store owner unhurriedly completed the word and returned to the counter with 2 cups of coffee, one offered to the old teacher. "I hope you don't have the bargain stuff here." The best coffee in the lower city is all like this. He sat down opposite the old man with the dagger acting as the dividing line between the two. Strictly speaking, these rumors are true, Duncan said slowly. I had an illness previously, all right, a rather severe illness. I relied on strong spirits to numb my nerves when the painkillers didn't work. It was during that period that I fell into decadence. It appears my condition has affected Nina's adolescence life more than I previously thought. Morris carefully observed Duncan for a long time before he spoke thoughtfully. Is that so? But I don't feel like you're someone who has just come out of decadence. More like a gentleman who has never fallen into decadence to begin with. And your wit, your humor, it's not like that of someone who's been influenced by alcohol. Speaking of this, he took a sip from the cup without making any evaluation of the coffee but rather on Duncan himself. I believe I'm a good evaluation of others in this regard. Maybe it's just that I'm adjusting my mindset relatively quickly, Duncan laughed, his tone extraordinarily calm. He had to admit that this old man did see people accurately, but he did not believe a local historian could see through to his secret. Nina is almost an adult, and I am her only guardian. I have to show some responsibility at some point. Regardless, that's a good thing for that kid if that's your view. Morris gave Duncan a deep look. She's in a critical stage of her studies. While many say that they can only go to the factory to tighten bolts after graduating from the public schools, I disagree. Knowledge in itself is a valuable asset, and when it shows its light at some point in one's life, it will be astronomical to their success. Ads by PubFuture. The old man said, shaking his head. Unfortunately, most of the parents I have dealt with do not agree with this notion. Their attention is always on having their children graduate as soon as possible and finding a job afterward. Regarding this topic, Duncan almost got a type of familiar kinship. Like any teacher, Duncan also had his fair share of saying similar things to the parents of his students back on Earth. But soon, he retracted this kinship mentality and shook his head slightly after remembering the living conditions of this world. Because this is the lower city, Mr. Morris. Your view is indeed wise and visionary, but most people here will only worry about the ability to pay next month's bill. You can't ask folks to have long-term visions under such conditions. Indeed, many people are limited by the great difficulties of life. The old teacher sighed like he was pained by the situation. Sorry for soaking up your time like this. I'm sure you have your own woes as well. However, my worries appear unnecessary after getting to know you. Worries? Duncan frowned. Did something happen to Nina at school recently? Have her grades regressed? Her grades have always been good, but lately, she's been distracted. Morris weighed her vocabulary to not cause panic. She tends to mentally wander off in class and sleep during the study sessions. Then in the previous chemistry class last week, she accidentally set a lab table on fire. This has never happened before, at least never with her. Speaking of this, the old teacher paused and added, her grades for the first 2 terms did not drop by much, but if she continues in this state, it will be difficult to say if she will graduate with honors. I agree that options are limited to those graduating from the public school system. However, assembling machines in the lower city factories and maintaining the steam cores at the churches of the upper city are totally different things. As Nina's guardian, I ask that you pay closer attention to her studies. Nina has been distracted from class lately. Duncan frowned. She didn't tell me about it. A girl of this age certainly won't tell you much. Morris shook his head. I thought at first that something bad must have happened at home, or something her alcoholic uncle had done recently that affected her mental state. But now, it appears the reason is entirely different. Duncan didn't speak for a while, only trying to recall if there's any abnormality in the child's behavior in the past couple of days. Then before he could get anywhere, Morris's voice came again, you know her best. Has anything abnormal happened to Nina recently? Such as not resting well, or her health deteriorating? Duncan pondered for a long time to only spread his hands out. To my shame, I can't think of an answer. He couldn't figure out the answer because he hadn't even known Nina for a week ago. How would he know what changes occurred recently? Ads by PubFuture. Morris didn't seem too surprised by Duncan's answer, probably because he had lowered his expectations for Nina's uncle, according to anecdotal rumors before he arrived. Speaking habitually, you should pay more attention to her, especially for girls this age. Material support alone is not enough. As soon as Duncan heard this, A thought suddenly appeared in his mind. Could she be in love? Frankly speaking, this idea was more or less based on Zhou Ming's experience as a people's teacher. Morris showed a somewhat strange expression after hearing this, with an even weirder look in those eyes. It's an all-girls school. Duncan thought about it and looked serious. Girls' school is also possible. Morris's eyes widened slightly. NOVEL-BJN.C ohm. This old gentleman, who has always been fascinated by academics, was shocked. Oomph, don't mind me, I'm just speaking hypothetically. Duncan knew as soon as he saw the old man's reaction that this topic might be a little over the top. Quickly moving on to avoid this embarrassing situation, I'll talk to Nina properly, she should be willing to tell me. Oh, of course, the old gentleman finally came back to his senses due to the shock. As far as I understand, Nina is a very good and honest child. If you talk with her, I'm sure she wouldn't resist too much. Duncan nodded. Is there anything else that I should be aware of? Aside from being distracted, there's nothing else that I'm aware of. The old man thought about it and shook his head. I actually came today mainly to talk about this matter and to learn of her real family situation. Speaking of this, Nina's parents are 11 years ago, Duncan said, the official record of the incident was a leak at a chemical plant in the 6th block. I see, the old gentleman sighed, I remember the accident as well. Back then, my daughter and I happened to be at the crossroad when the commotion started. It caused quite a stampede of fleeing bystanders due to the chemical leak. Afterwards, the investigation also said that many cultists took the opportunity to rampage across the lower city that night. Duncan's heart jumped at this. Then, forcing himself to act calm and casual, was there a fire in the lower city that night? Fire. I don't remember any fire. Morris frowned. I believe you must have been mistaken. Looks like I'm misremembered, Duncan said with a smile and pressed his temple. I really should stay away from alcohol. Chapter 90 Inches The antique shop's first big sale. Duncan had expected Morris's reaction. The reason he asked was only to confirm the question. As he had previously known, ordinary people like Morris had no idea that a fire existed, the only ones who knew were Nina and his own memory. Or, strictly speaking, until he took charge of this body. The topic was quickly skipped over with no further questions from Mr. Morris. Afterward, the two continued to talk about various subjects regarding Nina's studies and how she was doing in class. Through the conversation, it could be seen that the old gentleman cared a lot about his students, but due to Nina's uncle's previous depraved lifestyle, the meeting got postponed to this day. And when the business of today's visit finally got finished, Mr. Morris's attention unsurprisingly fell on his second concern. The old man eyed the well-preserved antique dagger on the counter, and the eagerness in his eyes could be seen by anyone. This thing, do you want to sell it? Duncan immediately smiled. This is an antique shop. Antiques in an antique shop are of course meant to be sold. He's thought it through. Although this dagger came from the vanished, but if you think about it, there seems to be no hidden danger in selling it. There are many things on that ghost ship, and not all of them are related to the supernatural, like this dagger for example. If thrown elsewhere, it was just an ordinary antique, so why couldn't he sell it? Compared with the pile of fakes in the store, the warehouse on the vanished was a good means to get money. As soon as his train of thought smoothed out, Duncan suddenly found the world growing wider. Then he realized something incredible. He was actually sitting on a treasure trove. Those things regarded as garbage on the vanished, like chipped copper coins, or iron scrap metals tossed in a corner, are all treasures in the eyes of these historians. Morris didn't know what scheming thoughts were turning in the head of the antique shop owner. His attention was all on the well-preserved dagger in front of him at this time. After a long period of hesitation, the old gent cautiously spoke. How much? Duncan. Ads by PubFuture. Heaven and earth just became narrow again. Why? Because he did not know how much to set. Even if he inherited the memory of this body in its entirety, he still wouldn't know what price to set for this antique. This store had never sold a single real thing since its opening. Without question, he first ruled out the option of charging 2,000 or 3,000 solas. Even if the dagger were real and exceptional, it's no more than 100 years old according to the details Morris revealed. Besides, it's not like the dagger was unique. There are others out there, albeit in a worse condition, but it's still out there. Secondly, Morris was Nina's history teacher. If he butchers him up knowing how fond the old gent was of the dagger, it would inevitably leave a bad impression for the girl. Earning a small profit at the price of ruining the niece's image before the teacher was stupid. Any parent would know better than to test that theory. Eventually, Duncan could only shake his head and smile. He's given up and decides to toss the problem over. You make an offer, Mr. Morris. You are Nina's most respected teacher, and I really can't make a price like I would for an ordinary customer. Morris pondered the issue seriously, but not for long though. 3,400 solas, this is my estimate, Morris finally spoke. He seemed to have considered the number a little before settling on it. Mr. Duncan, you may think that the price is too low, but take into account the age of the dagger and its historical positioning. This kind of non-unique collection is very discounted in the market. Of course, its condition is exceptionally good, which is rare, but not all collectors are interested in this. The old gentleman seemed to be trying to explain his reasoning for this number, and Duncan listened intently as well. In the lower city, the total expenses of the average family of 3 in a month are around 200 to 300 solas. That's under the premise they wouldn't have any leftovers, and the savings would be very little even if they did. Therefore, the dagger was almost equivalent to a family's income for 1.5 years. No.B in .c ohm. Duncan honestly didn't know if he should lament on how an antique shop could hit it so big in one day, or if he should lament the striking gap of buying power between the ordinary people and those living in the upper city. Or perhaps he should sigh at how rich this old gent was. Deal, he exhaled softly and said to the old man with a smile. There's no need to haggle and waste time for them both. In any case, this was a lot of money for Nina and him now, even more than the bounties of reporting those cultists. Not long ago, he was still thinking about the way to make money, but now he found that this matter seemed to be less urgent. Ads by PubFuture. The world sure was impermanent. Contrary to the shop owner's frank attitude, Morris on the other hand felt that Duncan had agreed to the deal too easily. He even felt apologetic for not going higher. Actually, you are taking a loss at this price. By normal estimate, the dagger should fetch another 10 or 20%. But, the old man scratched his nose and seemed to be a little embarrassed. I spent a bit too much on collecting in recent days, so my hands are a bit tight on money right now. The old gentleman was even more candid than Duncan imagined. I think it's a good price, and the difference in the middle should be because of fate, Duncan says with a smile, and then as if suddenly remembering something, he got up and walked behind the counter. By the way, I have a giveaway to celebrate this big sale. Morris watched curiously at the shop owner until he saw the small amethyst pendant being pulled out from a small compartment behind the counter. The old man's eyes were sharp, and he immediately noticed the label of a certain glass workshop on the item, which hadn't been removed yet. Morris. A pendant with a calming effect. The crystal has been blessed with the guiding light of dispelling curses and illusions. Ancient hypnotists used this to protect their spirits from the dangers lurking in the dream world. Duncan pushed the pendant over with a serious expression. It has protected generations of owners in the past, and now it is yours by fate. Morris hesitantly pointed to the label, but it says that it is produced by Johnny Glass Workshop. I know, I forgot to take it off. Duncan peeled off the label with an expressionless face. This is a giveaway. There's no way I would have so many real antiques in this shop to give away, right? Morris was stunned for a moment, then he couldn't help but laugh. Ha, you're right on that point. Thank you very much for the giveaway. With this thing, I hope my daughter will nag me less. He said as he accepted the pendant, and then fiddled with his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. I didn't bring as much cash with me when I came out. This check can be cashed at the local branch at the crossroad. Is this all right with you? Duncan smiled. Of course. As he said this, his gaze fell on Morris's booklet. He's already had his doubts about this history teacher when Nina mentioned the guy, and now, that doubt grew even bigger. Whether in terms of the wardrobe or daily words used during their conversation, the old gent was clearly not ordinary. He's too sophisticated, a characteristic trait not commonly found even in the upper city. A scholar of that caliber could easily get a job at the only university in this city. Even if other factors are not considered, there's also another obvious problem. Can an ordinary public school teacher so casually spend a person's annual income in a single purchase?